Thanks, Cyrus. Thanks everyone for attending. I appreciate you making the time for this, and I kind of have a general plan, which really sort of keeps me on track. Otherwise, this could be a lot longer of a session. So if things come up, please do put them in the chat. I'm happy to always go off topic and go another direction, particularly because it's going to be your interest that's been generated. So let's jump in. So audience participation, I'm curious, why do you exercise? So you can put it in the chat, you can raise your hand, maybe just kind of getting our brains going, just to give some feedback. Why do you exercise? Anyone want to share? Nice. Good, we have some honesty in the crowd. Thank you, Lori. Great. Good. So we have, we can see in the chat, we have a variety of input. Yeah, you like it? Oh, novel. Aging healthfully, great. To feel good, stay strong. So the beautiful part about this, other than your willingness to share, is that it's different for everyone. And so that is kind of our goal today, is to look at, some of you might have thought, well, maybe you're thinking, well, what is exercise, right? What's she asking? What's she asking me? Do I like to do, or why do I do what I do? And so that's really the first thing we want to think about, is how do we define exercise? My thought would be is that for each of you that contributed something, that it might mean different things to different people. And so that's really where we're going to start with what actually constitutes physical activity and what constitutes exercise. And the other part that I threw in there, which I'm a big proponent of play. We don't talk a lot about play today, but there is data and research that shows the importance and the relative nature of play in our lives. So when we look at just the technical definition, and we look at what physical activity is, it's any bodily movement produced by skeletal muscles that expend energy. Right? So anything essentially that we do above rest. And then we have to decide, what is rest? So if we're talking about a clinical definition of rest, we're talking about you being in a prone position, probably a laying position, not doing anything for a specific amount of time. So anything above that is actual physical activity, which maybe makes you feel a little more hopeful that you fit in, maybe could have answered that question about why do you exercise? And then when we look at exercise, it's actually doing something by choice. So it's voluntary physical activity that either has a plan. So there might be a progression of you're doing something a certain amount of time over, a period of time, maybe training for something, or just with a goal in mind. There's usually repetition. And that could be repetition in the actual session that you're doing. So it could be, if you're doing a walking program, you're doing physical repetition or skeletal muscle repetition, or you're doing something with repeated doses. So you're doing it regularly, or have consistency in that. And then oftentimes when we look at exercise, it has something to do with health and or fitness, which is important to, again, define what is health. Right. So some of you, I know in many of our classes, we talk about the concept of what something that is healthy vice unhealthy, and what does that mean to someone, and who is defining that from what perspective, and what lens are they looking through when they talk about improve health. Health by just pure definition is the absence of disease. And if we look at what disease is and the definition of disease, if we break that word into the prefix in the word, it's dis, which is something that's, like disorganized or discombobulated. And we think about something that's easeful, it's easier, without resistance, or it has fluidity to it. So when we think about disease, it's something that's out of balance, what we're going to talk about in a minute, this idea of homeostasis. And then fitness we'll come back to, because that's an important one and could often be a barrier to why someone might say, I don't even know what to do. I don't even know what is physical activity or what is exercise. So I'm going to give up. There's nothing, I don't even know where to start. And where do we get our concepts of what is fitness? And that oftentimes goes along with what is health. And then when we think about play, that's just doing something, and oftentimes in the animal world, play, there are, and when we think about benefits of movement, play has a lot of neurological development, a lot of social constructs that are learned through play, and it doesn't necessarily have to be just for in our young years, although our early childhood development faculty probably know that when kids don't play as much, or animals don't play as much early on, certain things don't happen in their neurological development. So is there a place for play also where we can put that into counting as movement? Another question that comes to mind is, were we designed to exercise? So maybe in the chat, do you think some people kind of struggle with this, of when they don't do movement, they might feel like not the norm, or they might feel guilty, or they might feel a certain way when they don't do this thing called exercise. But were we designed to exercise by an evolutionary standpoint? What do you think? A little opinion in the chat. Yes, no, any thoughts? All right, absolutely yes, okay. Any other? Oh, I like that. Thanks, Christina. We were designed to move. Any other thoughts? So from an evolutionary standpoint, were we designed to do that thing, that voluntary physical activity that's planned, structured, undertaken with purpose to sustain health and fitness? Thanks, Michelle. Okay. Ooh, we have a good variety. Great. Great. I love it. We are designed to survive by using movement. Awesome. So if we do, I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but there is really interesting data to support that we weren't designed to do this exercise thing. We were designed to move when we went from when we kind of moved into our evolution into bipedal, or being on two legs, and what we were doing in our lives as hunter-gatherers, and then moving into farming or agrarian practice, and then moving into the later kind of more modern area of the industrial revolution. Really, by evolutionary design, we're designed to grow, we're designed to reproduce, and we're designed to survive. Those are the things that the body's working to accomplish. And it's working to accomplish that through this concept of homeostasis, which ties back into that idea of health or the absence of disease. Homeostasis is the idea of maintaining things in a same state or similar state, so that we can optimize the potential for us to grow, to reproduce, and to survive. So when we think about, exercise, and just maybe in movement in general, so maybe for the purposes of our talk, we'll shift to movement in general. How has our environment changed in a way that it's challenging our movement? Right. So as we've become more, or as the sort of industrial revolution in the United States, kind of late 1800s, 1900s, presented us with opportunities for mechanization, for automating some of the things that we would have done from a physical standpoint or a labor standpoint. A lot of the social transformations that happen, moving of people from urban to less urban places, different types of jobs that people were undertaking, different organizations of social constructs. I would imagine we have a grouping of individuals that could contribute to a number of different changes that have shaped the culture that we exist in now. And so there's been a lot of things that have changed just in our environment. And how has that challenged our movement, or how has that changed our movement? And then kind of figuring out, where do we fit in that? So that's always an important part to explore when you yourself are framing your own concepts of what is physical activity for myself, what is exercise for myself, and where does it fit? What do I want to get out of it? Right? What is it going to do to serve me in my purposes? It's an important part. The other idea is that when we look at how the body itself, the human structure, moves in its environment, it's oftentimes looked at as this thing called a complex adaptive system. So we don't just we do one thing and there's only a linear effect of that when we do movement. Even if we were to stand now, if some of you are probably standing in this talk, but even if we were to stand now and do some 2 minutes of high knee marching, we would have shifts and changes that would happen in our acute response to exercise, or in our acute response to movement. But it would also have potentially a biochemical effect in our minds. And if it's changing something in our brain, it's going to affect the rest of our bodies. Our heart rate's going to increase. We'll have a respiratory shift. We may have a little bit of a immune shift as well, depending on what else our body is maintaining or working to sort of adapt to in its environment. So when we do these movement, or we choose to do anything above rest in our environment, we're creating a demand, and our body is responding to that demand. And if we do that one time, it's going to have certain responses that might be more notable than others. And if we do that over a period of time, then we're going to have some adaptations that are going to occur for us. So that brings us to when we do movement, depending on how long we're doing that, how often we're doing that, and the intensity or how hard or the effort we're putting into that, we can see that the body can respond, one, to make that shift from rest to exercise, and those would be considered acute responses to exercise. For example, right now, while we're sitting here, our body is still needing to do all the things, all the cellular work that it needs to do. If you did some exercise yesterday, it may be still recovering from the exercise and healing and repairing if you did some type of exercise, or I should say exercise bout. If your immune system's working on something, it's allocating energy to that. And so right now, most of your blood flow is in your gastrointestinal tract or your genitourinary tract, and it's doing its functions. If you just ate lunch, it's doing some digestive functions, and it's not hanging out in the skeletal muscles. So when we get up and we start to do something, we have to make those shifts. And for us, depending on the types of movement we do on a regular basis, whether we're inactive or we're active, however we define that, our body can make that initial adjustment with a little more ease, or it might be a more noticeable change. But we do, again, as a complex adaptive system where those systems are interconnected and intertwined, we are going to have adjustments made on multiple fronts. And I think that's one of the things that challenges figuring out for people what to do, is that there are so many multi-dimensional benefits of movement. And when we don't have movement, our body also can adapt to sedentary behaviors. Our body can adapt to inactivity. And so we have all of these really profound things that can happen, one, in right away, but then when we continue to do movement over time, we have a whole nother set of adaptations that can happen. Again, we can go back to that, what are we designed to do? Those adaptations support us in being able to grow and repair, potentially reproduce, if that's something that our body is our optimization to do. And it could potentially increase our likelihood of surviving, or in the exercise physiology world, we talk about mortality versus morbidities. And mortality is your likelihood of dying from something. And the morbidities are some of the diseases or imbalances that may come along as a result of, or as a missing link of something in your life. There also is interesting data in the exercise world of when certain amounts of activity in individuals, and it related to what we call diseases of mismatched environments. So if we are sedentary in an environment that has a profound amount of food availability, not just quantity of food, but caloric density of foods, and we don't have the movement or the expenditure side, how does that end up in having mismatched diseases of environment, say metabolic syndromes like type 2 diabetes or overweight and obese? So it's a very complex situation. I hope you weren't attending this session for the one answer or the magic pill that I was going to share with you. There isn't one. Any questions or comments so far? Should we keep plugging through to get to some myths about exercise? No? Okay. Everyone is expert in this. Oh. So also, not to just, when we think about energy expenditure, so movement, when we do stuff above rest. So if we lay in that one position for 24 hours, our body needs energy. So there is still an energy cost of inactivity in a sense. And that is so the body can accomplish all it needs to do to essentially keep us alive. And that is often referred to as the resting metabolic rate. There's also a basal metabolic rate collected in a relatively different clinical environment. But our resting metabolic rate tells us about the amount of energy, calories, that we need in a 24-hour period to sustain all the functions that our body needs to accomplish. That percentage there can vary because our resting metabolic rate can be, for some, about 50% of that total energy expenditure in a 24-hour period. And for others, it could be more. Body composition does have a correlation with higher resting metabolic rate. When you have maintained more lean mass is typically more metabolically active, so it requires more energy to maintain at rest. So there's going to be variability. There's variability in everything when it comes to humans, as we're pretty unique. So when we combine that with other energy needs that we have in a day, where does that activity or exercise come in? When we do exercise, anything above rest, we do generate heat, and heat is one of the byproducts of muscle contraction. So when we have ATP at work, adenosine triphosphate at work, facilitating muscle contraction in the skeletal muscle, we generate heat. We're taking chemical compounds and we're doing mechanical work with those. So there is a cost to that as well. And then there, on a smaller percentage, but could still be significant, is the things that we eat. So when we're fueling ourselves for exercise or movement, or even recovery from movement, there is a value of energy that is expended in our body being able to get the energy. So if we eat a carbohydrate, protein, or fat source through the digestive process of metabolism, our body, it costs the body energy for some foods more than others to get that usable form, whether if it's carbohydrates, it's glucose, if it's fats, it's fatty acids, if it's proteins, it's going to be those amino acids, and then getting into the energy systems. And we'll talk a little bit about that for what we're using fuel for based on what we're doing. Bottom line is back to doing something above rest. Is our energy expenditure, so those calories we're expending in a day, has anyone ever wondered how did they figure that out? Like, how do I know how many calories I need in a day? There's many estimates or formulas that you could use to estimate, but direct measurements we could do two ways. One would be measuring how much oxygen you take in, so oxygen consumption, and carbohydrate production. So when we breathe in oxygen from external respiration, we get into the body, goes into the bloodstream, goes to all the cells to support the aerobic processes that are happening. The exchange is metabolic waste products and carbon dioxide, and we exhale that out. And the ratio of those two can show us what our energy demands are of our body based on what we're doing. And then we can calculate either directly or indirectly how much energy we expend in our activity or our movement in a day. We'll look at a couple ways to do that. And then thermic effective food, that could also be estimated or directly measured by urine excretion. So our gas exchange, our breathing, represents fuel utilization. So it might connect that if we do more above rest, we increase our respiration. And as a result, for every liter of oxygen that we consume to do skeletal muscle work, if we're doing movement of some kind, whether it's dancing or cycling or resistance training or a yoga class or just going for a walk, has an energy value of 5 kilocalories or 5 calories. And so there's that benefit of increasing that, along with many of the other benefits that you shared in the beginning of why you do exercise or why you do movement. So when we get to, let's see if we can go forward here. Again, if I'm going too fast or too slow or stimulating any questions, let me know. So this energy that we take into our body, when we're doing movement, so at rest, so right now, well, we're not really at rest, but when we're not doing movement, our body often uses a mixture of fats and carbohydrates. We store some carbohydrates in our body in the form of something called glycogen. We can store it in our muscles and our liver. And then we store fat in our subcutaneous stores, in our adipocytes or our fat cells. We are very good stores of fat in general. And any excess energy that we intake that we're not utilizing gets stored as fat. So when we're at rest, we're using a mix of those two things. When we do movement, and it's movement that is a lower intensity movement. So if we talk about low to moderate intensity, it might be something you're doing where you could talk to someone the whole time, or maybe every now and again you have to take a few breaths, but you can do it over time. We would say that those are aerobic type of expenditures, and they could be anything beyond rest. And from those, we typically are utilizing fats as our primary fuel source. But if we're doing something that has little intervals built into it, let's say we're going on a hike and we're hiking along and there's a little bit of an incline, a little grade, and then a little descent, and then some up and downs, we can again draw for these energy systems in our skeletal muscle to do the work needed to accomplish that task. And so it's going to draw from different energy systems in a sense in our bodies, based on what we have stored, or based on what we have taken into our bodies. So our movement, if we have that variety, can, in a sense, train ourselves to be more metabolically efficient by using both fats as well as carbohydrates for the work that it's doing. When we do things that are in this chart, you see on the very left, power, and you see the bottom graph of capacity, which is essentially duration. Power would be how hard we're working. So we have a very first initial energy system called the ATP-CP or ATP-PCR system, which is we're not synthesizing ATP, which is the energy that is needed along with calcium and an action potential for muscle contraction to happen, but it is going to do things like lifting something really heavy one time, and then you set it down and you need to take a break before you can do it again. And then we have we have fiber types in our skeletal muscle fibers that are designed to do that type of work. And they're going to use our quick sources of energy, which is going to be our carbohydrates. And then we have our middle energy system, which is called fast glycolysis or anaerobic glycolysis. And that's also for that could go back to our hike example where we're maybe riding our bikes and we come to a hill and we have to basically shift our gears, shift our energy systems and our gears to do the work. And so we're going to be tapping into also our carbohydrate stores to be able to do that muscle work, to make the bike go or to climb that hill, and then our body can still be using other energy systems. You might notice that proteins are typically not a primary fuel source for the exercise we do, but they do have a really important role when we do any type of resistive or load-bearing exercises that result in micro trauma to the cells or something called exercise-induced muscle injury. Proteins are really important in helping facilitate recovery and protein synthesis to do the healing part in our skeletal muscle cells. And as we have that healing happen, then we have kind of reinforcement happen in the cells that are being repaired. And as a result, we may have an increase in the ability to do work with those muscles, which would be referred to as muscle endurance, or we might even have an increase in our lean mass or our muscle mass, which could relate to muscle strength as well. So we have that adaptation happen, and protein has a significant role in that during exercise. So that's kind of the fueling or our energy needs that we have in our metabolism when we do movement, and we're asking the body to do more above rest. We can actually use the fuel source we have, the stored fuel sources we have, to do that work. And so that could be also a benefit that was suggested in our opening conversation there about, makes me, maybe it keeps an energy balance in between you and the environment that you're living in. Or maybe it just makes you feel good because blood flow is increased to areas that it isn't typically increased to at rest. It's not typically going to our skeletal muscles. We know that over time, when we do that chronic movement or the overtime movement as our body adapts, we become, exercise initially has an inflammatory effect because in the acute form, it's something that stresses the body, but when we do it regularly, it actually has an anti-inflammatory effect in a number of different capacities, which can be beneficial. Again, we have to have balance of pro and anti-inflammatory factors, but it might make us less inflammatory when it comes to, say, insulin utilization or cortisol levels in our body. And so as a result, it changes some biochemical balance and we feel better overall, which is something that I hear often when people do some type of movement, they feel better in general. Right? Yeah. All right, let's keep. So this was relates to when we do movement. If anyone's ever gone to a formal exercise environment like a gym, you might have noticed that on a lot of the cardio equipment, they have a place where when you get done with your exercise, it tells you how much energy you've expended, right? A word of caution on that is unless you put in your specific data, like your body composition and your age and maybe your height and your weight and what your resting metabolic values are, it may overestimate, more than likely will overestimate the amount of energy. And if you're using that as well, I've exercised, so I can eat this much, you might find yourself in a tricky situation from as far as a balance that your body is working to find. So often when in exercise, when we're estimating energy expenditure, we can again go towards respiratory measurements. So we have a lot of great equipment that we can put on athletes or individuals who are looking to see what their expenditure is. We put a mouthpiece on them, or basically a face mask. It's attached now to a mobile backpack. They go out and they do their run, or we can even do metabolic testing in the pool. They do their workout. We collect their data, and it's really their respiratory data. So it's that oxygen consumed, CO2 expelled. From then we can measure what they have used for energy in their physical activity or for their exercise. The tricky part is, what about all the stuff we do in the other 16 hours of our day, right? So what about when you're just walking around and you're moving? Those of you that are choosing to stand versus sit in your work environments, there's a higher energy cost to that. Going for a little walk in between your Zoom meetings, doing, movement, those become more difficult to measure. Or what about gardening? Or what about doing what might be classified as leisure activities? Those have energy values as well. So there is a resource called the Compendium of Physical Activity. You can Google it. It's a pretty extensive document, and it assigns what are called metabolic equivalents to everything that you can imagine. It's a global document, which is really interesting because it looks at things like something that comes to mind is working in a rice paddy. So how much energy per hour does it cost to do that task? How much does it cost to do laundry? And if you're carrying your laundry, to do your dishes, all these types of things that, now 100 years ago became more automated, they do have energy values because they are requiring movement above rest. So these METs, or metabolic equivalents, have to do with oxygen consumption, and they are assigned variable numbers in this Compendium of Physical Activity. And so if you knew the MET expenditure of whatever you were doing, the example here I gave is swimming freestyle at a moderate effort. One, you'd have to know what moderate is based on the compendium. It's probably about 60% of your max effort, or maybe 5 on a rate of perceived exertion scale of how hard you're working. Then you could multiply that by a resting MET of 3.5 times your body weight in kilograms and divide it by 200. And it would tell you that this is estimating how much energy it's costing you to do this activity, this swimming per minute. And then based on how long you swam, you could multiply that and get an idea. So, when would we use this? For individuals that are interested in looking at tracking their energy intake, quality and quantity of intake, so what's coming in for potential energy to do exercise or physical activity or movement, they might be curious at how much do they move in a day? Maybe they underestimate how much they move in a day. And so, maybe we'll talk about this in the next session if people are interested in how do I do these baseline assessments. So you really have to take a bit of time, but go through 3 days maybe of your schedule and do your estimates on energy expenditure. And then you kind of can look and see, and then you can calculate in that third part, that thermic effect of food, and have an idea. And then think, how am I doing? How am I feeling? What are my goals again for this movement in my life, right? What purpose do I want it to serve? So that would be how we would estimate that value of movement. All right, another audience participation. Let's move into some myths of exercise or about exercise. Popular media, any source of popular media or media in general, what claims related to exercise have you heard or are curious about? Throw them in the chat. Awesome, no pain, no gain, good. It's the only one, come on, we're inundated with them. What's out there? Awesome, use it or lose it. And I think you guys pre-read my slides. No, it's good. No one's ever wondered something? There's no right or wrong answer. Anything, whether you think it may be correct or not, share. No? All right. Something else comes up. So I thought about in my classes and just in general, even with individuals that I train with, I hear some common statements. And so these were ones that I've heard most recently. So one is, as you age, chronologically, not necessarily we have physiological and chronological aging, but as you get older, it might be because I just had a birthday and someone asked me about it. Well, don't you lose lean mass? Like, don't you lose muscle as you age, right? That's just kind of like you're destined to do it. So that's something that I heard recently. Another statement I heard recently that you can turn fat to muscle with exercise. So you can transform it. Like it just magically changes. Another one I heard was feeling the burn and the no pain, no gain. If you don't have pain, it's not working, that you have to have that. So thanks for putting that one in the chat. Another one that came up in one of our classes was that spot training. So that if I want, the six-pack abs, that if you do crunches and sit-ups and trunk twists and all these things, that you can get six-pack abs. So you can directly train an area of your body through exercise, and it will change. Another one that I'm hearing more commonly, and I actually just read an article about it, is sitting is unhealthy. That's kind of been in on the radar for about the past year, right? Since have we been doing more of that or less of it? And then the other one that I've heard recently is that you have to go to a gym to exercise. And that was someone was sharing that they haven't done anything for the past year because their gym's been closed. So they can't do anything, right? So see how we're doing. So with our time, we don't have, oh, great. Oh, I love that. Yeah, the 10,000 steps a day, that's a great one too. Less calories. Oh, see, now they're all coming. Yes, awesome. Genetic tests, food sensitivities, BMR, cellular thoughts, and okay, that's a great one, Cyrus. Let's save that one and we'll close out with that one. That's a great one. Yeah, like the Everwell test. Is that what you're thinking about?
Yeah, there's like so many tests for these new, just to know if whether or not you have the proclivity to have this genetic marker, to gain weight, lose weight.
Yep.
Yeah, so
Cool.
things
Yeah.
like that.
Awesome. Good. I would say that so we could talk probably about all of these, but if we had to pick one, just for in the respect of time, in the chat, you want to vote for a one that you would like. Let's see, just a quick vote, would you put your number in the chat of which, if we were only talking about one of these statements for our session, which one would you think you'd be most curious about? And then we will include the body composition. We'll include the body composition one. Jason, thank you, when we do talk about some of these things.
Sorry, Cass. Just 1 second. So you said there's the three statements, one from Sherry, one from me, and one that Jason's put. Okay. I think people are understanding what the prompt is. Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah. So for first statement from Sherry, second statement from me, and then third statement from Jason.
Great. And it looks like most people are voting for number 2, which is what I'm seeing in our list would be the fat turns to muscle with exercise. Is that what people might be curious about, that one?
Yes.
Yes. Well then, let's go there.
That's coming from someone who's had 2 children.
Right, and that's okay, and that's good. That's okay. All right. So
son says, my youngest son says to me often, "Ooh, mommy, you're so soft." Or he'll say, "Mother, you have a hamburger." He's talking about my belly area.
He needs to appreciate what you have done for him. So again, like many of these things, let's start with the turning fat to muscle. And it will, I think, touch on a couple of the other areas of interest that people have expressed, which again, thank you so much for sharing these ideas. Again, this is the big part of it is, there is so much information out there, but like anything, anyone can put anything online. So how do we go through this and figure out what's credible, what's not, what's safe, what's unsafe, and just what is going to work for us? And that's a very, very important thing. So let's start with, what are we made of, right? And so if we're thinking about this, really depends on, in the exercise physiology world, the most typical model of what we're made of is we're made of fat mass and we're made of non-fat mass, or it's called lean mass. And our fat mass is made up of what would be called our essential and our non-essential fat. So fat does have a really important role for us. It has a lot of functions, protective functions, hormonal regulation functions, neurological functions. It helps with the myelination of our neurons. The condition, the ability of us to do many of our homeostatic functions do need essential fat. And then we have our non-essential fat, which can be stored in a couple different places for individuals, either called subcutaneous fat, which would be right under the skin, the layers of skin. And then we have this thing you might have heard of as our visceral fat stores or deeper fat stores. And so we'll look a little more at that. Lean mass is everything else. Essentially, it's our organs, our tissues, our skeletal muscle. It includes our smooth muscle, cardiac muscle. And bone density gets grouped into lean mass, but when we have body composition assessments, like this picture you see here is the same person in a scan called a DEXA scan, or a dual X-ray absorptometry scan. It sounds very scientific and fancy. It's actually, when we get back on campus, we'll be having actually this company called Body Spec coming to campus, and through a grant, we were able to get quite a few allocations for individuals to be able to get their DEXA scans done. Why is that important? It tells you specifically what your bone density is. Our skeletal structure doesn't weigh a significant amount for what you'd think it would. It's actually relatively light because of the cortical and the trabecular form of the bone. But density is important as through our whole lives, early on, but especially as we age. It gives us integrity, stability. It's still producing a lot of our immune function. There's so many, I mean, it's live tissue. It's just denser tissue. And so your DEXA scan tells you your bone density. It tells you your fat mass value, how many pounds of fat you are. And it also shows you where you store your fat, which everyone has different fat deposition patterns, which we talk about body shape, rounded, like more apple shaped versus pear shaped. There is genetic tendency to where we store our fat. And when we can't store our fat anymore, we start to store it in other places, oftentimes in those visceral or those deep fat stores. The number of fat cells we have it pretty much doesn't change through our whole lives, but the size of adipocytes or fat cells can change. For both our essential and typically our non-essential fat stores when we're storing additional energy that we haven't tapped into to use. And then our lean mass, we can also see in this DEXA scan, we can see it's the reddish, it's not the orange, it's the reddish color of that. And you can compare where you have the most lean mass, lower body, upper body, what you can compare right and left side of lean mass. So that's essentially knowing what you're made of. So if you do have movement is part of your overall plan with sleep and with managing the stressors in your life and with the type of energy that you're intaking and all the other things, the multi-dimensional aspects that contribute to what makes us us or in our containers, it's nice to know this because this is something that is really the elements of what we're made of and not representing what a scale would use. And I'll talk more about that in the second session about assessment and about different ways of body composition to do this type of assessment. So knowing what we're made of is an important thing to start, that we're fat mass and we're lean mass. So we mentioned a little bit of, these are just happen to be fat cells. It's white fatty tissue and fat cells are where the droplets of fat is a high energy potential for us. A gram of fat is about 9 kcals or calories versus a gram of carbohydrate is just over 4 and a gram of protein is also just over 4. So we have a lot of good potential energy in this fat. Unique characteristics as far as their cellular characteristics and again their storage capacities. Fats are stored as fatty acids and glycerols, or those are the bonds. When they're broken down, they can be used right away if there is a need for them to be used, either in some of the homeostatic functions or for energy. So we're out there doing movement and we're doing longer duration, lower intensity movement. So we can use fats as fueling for our aerobic movements or our whole body, either physical activity or exercise. So that's kind of the fat cells themselves. When we look at, this is actually a kind of cool picture. This is from something called Body Worlds, where it compares many different disease conditions and structure function conditions in humans. And this shows the different, how fat stores can affect overall body structures or organ structures in the system. So the image on the left is someone that would had a relatively streamlined body composition. You can see they have a little bit of subcutaneous fat on the posterior aspect of their back there, a little bit lining, again, serving the protective function is what fat does for us. Also insulation for keeping the homeostatic function of body temperature. And you don't see a lot of fat in this, where the deep fat stores would be, which would be in that abdominal region. You don't see many, versus the other plastinate that's next to them on the right side. You see this sort of wavy form both on the anterior and posterior aspect of the body. Those are subcutaneous fat stores. So those would be additional or non-essential fat stores. And then you would also see quite a bit of visceral fat stores in the abdominal or thoracic thoraabdominal region, where when we pack extra stuff, essentially fat is not very metabolically active. Again, it stores, but it'd be like if you were a really good saver and you put a lot of money in the bank, but you didn't take it out. Fat's very good at keeping the money in the bank, and it actually takes energy to mobilize fat out of the bank into the energy systems to utilize. And so when it gets stored in the deep visceral areas of the body, it doesn't have a lot of blood flow to it. And so it can actually take away from the efficiency of some of the body systems, like the liver, for example, or the pancreas, or other, even the kidneys, depending on where those deep fat stores are. And then you can see over time, again, the body can adapt to anything. You can see the changing, almost the kyphosis in the spinal column here. That's changed. There should be a slight curve, but not an accentuated curve, but it has changed, adapting to that stressor over time. So it's kind of an interesting visual to how we might store fat. So when we compare that to skeletal muscle, which I'm not going to spend much time on smooth muscle or cardiac muscle, we're interested in when we go from rest to exercise and we're doing using chemical compounds or our energy of carbohydrates, fats to do mechanical work, which is what's happening when muscles contract. We have 640 some muscles. If they contract, we start with something called an action potential in the brain, which is where muscle contraction starts. Motor neurons conduct down through our central nervous system, out through the peripheral nervous system to those muscles, and they excite those muscles. A series of events happen. And then this picture on your right is actually inside a muscle cell. And inside a muscle cell, we have some contractile proteins and we have some regulatory proteins. We have this incredible cellular environment. We also have calcium, which is very important in muscle contraction. And then we have that energy currency, that ATP, also in a muscle cell. And so when muscles contract and they slide and they shorten, muscles shorten when they contract. And when they do that on a macro level, and you're picking something up like doing a bicep curl, the muscles of the bicep start to overlap maximally. You feel that bulge in your bicep, which means those fibers have overlapped maximally. And now the muscles are also connected to the joint above and below the muscle. And as a result, that muscle contracts and you're able to do that work. You're able to do that bicep curl or pick up that bag of groceries. And so you can see just by the image of what a fat cell looks like versus what muscle cells look like. If you noticed with the fat cells, they were kind of whitish yellowy, versus our muscle cells are going to be based on the different fiber types of our muscles. Our muscles are made up of a mixed fibers. They have different characteristics, is probably the best way to say it, where they can do work, what I talked about earlier, doing work for a long period of time at a lower intensity. Those are our type 1 fibers. And then we have fibers that can be explosive, like we need to run to catch the bus. Those are our sprinting fibers or our type 2 fibers. And then we have these other cool fibers that kind of behave in between. And so the reason that they're different, they're pink or darker red or lighter, like a white color, is based on the amount of blood flow they need, based on the amount of energy they have in them, which is called glycogen. And so just to compare fat cells to muscle, completely different. And so to think that we're going to exercise and transform a fat cell into this beautiful skeletal muscle, it's not possible. It's just from a physiological standpoint, not possible. So it doesn't mean, again, that our movement isn't going to result in possibly, we'll go back to the slide, isn't going to result in losing fat. So you do this DEXA scan, and instead of having 38 pounds of fat, both essential and non-essential. Now you have 36 pounds of fat. That could happen. And that's going to change the ratio of fat mass to lean mass, or your body fat percent. So when we do lose fat, essentially it's because we've done work or movement, exercise, group it all in there, and we've taken more oxygen in, and most importantly, we've exhaled carbon dioxide. Ruben Merman's done some really interesting, he's a physicist, but he's done really interesting research on metabolism and how it ties into our breathing. And when we do lose fat, we technically don't lose it because we still have the fat cells there, but the fat cells become smaller because they're not swelled with all that energy that we have stored in them. So the fat cell number doesn't change. The one way to change your fat cell number would get your fat cells sucked out, like liposuction. That would change your overall number of fat cells. But when we do exercise, they do get smaller. And then as we increase our muscle mass on our bodies, which is demanding more energy at rest, so we're requiring more energy to maintain that, we have some benefits that go along with those two things as well, right? And often, not always, but oftentimes they're paired together. So that's kind of dispelling that myth about changing fat to muscle. And then when we do lose fat, where does it go? And how muscle mass can have importance beyond just requiring more energy to maintain. It can also have some benefits with our inflammatory profiles, our functionality, right? Our muscles can help us to do work throughout the day, all the things that we do in a day. So they support our posture, our postural muscles, which is really anything below our collarbone, all the way to our femurs, to the mid femurs. All those muscles are muscles of postures that keep us upright. So that's a good one. Any thoughts hearing that? Hopefully I didn't disappoint anyone. Oh, someone had a DEXA. Nice. Gina, did they go over it with you? Said she had a DEXA scan last week. No? Okay. Cool. So, So just to kind of wrap it up, since I've almost exceeded my time, your time. So movement's significant because we're this complex adaptive system. So movement is important. We may have not evolved to exercise, but the way we're set up and designed, we are designed to move. And again, we can adapt to movement and we can adapt to inactivity. And sometimes those adaptations match or mismatch with our environment, and they may challenge us in certain ways, maybe related to diseases of misuse, or hypokinetic diseases, which are diseases correlated, not caused necessarily by low movement. We could approach our movement philosophy as training for resilience, right, in our environment. So we have this environment that is set up designed for us not to move much. It has maybe automation that if you never know anything different, you expect that you're not supposed to do certain things. But how can we create opportunities for movement, and then as a result have the changes in our complex adaptive system that make us more resilient potentially? So maybe decreasing some of the morbidities that are associated with over impacts of a less movement-based environment. And then bottom line, I know it's not what a lot of people like to hear, but we really are our own experiments. And even guidelines that exist, whether they're CDC guidelines or Health and Human HHS guidelines, they are guidelines. And they're typically based on ginormous epidemiological studies. At the end of the day, you need to figure out what works for you, just like food labels. What works for you, not necessarily what someone has informed you to do. We are unique in that way. And again, I know that's not necessarily what people want to hear, but I am more than willing to work with any one of you if you're interested in figuring out how to even start figuring out what do you want to do and what do you need to do, as far as in your own body and in your own place, in your own environment. So I offer you my email. Any other comments? Oh, they advise you to take calcium. That's pretty interesting. Okay. We can always talk about that offline if you'd like. Yeah, thank all of you. Feel free to email me if you have any follow-up, or I know we covered a lot. If you want to spend time going into anything else in detail, happy to. And then Cyrus, about all the testings that are out there. You know, if it's genetic testing, are you thinking of like 23andMe, that type of stuff, or what?
I don't know. More so along the lines of like the food insensitivity ones.
Mhm.
What your body is more prone to or less prone to. I've seen other ones as well too, like you're more prone to digesting seeds that turn into fat or something like that.
Mhm.
Those kinds of genetic testing. I don't know what tests are called,
Mhm.
but I think it'll be a modification of every well, if that made sense.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, again, it's like anything, when we could look at that across many of the trends in health and fitness, or nutrition and fitness, like that whole industry, right? Suggesting that we can take one thing and take it into our bodies, and then it's going to have this endpoint effect, right?
Right.
But isn't more than likely related. There's so many other factors that contribute to like inflammation, right? Has so much data to say, well, we need to be anti-inflammatory, but do we? Because we right now, most of us, if we're getting the vaccine, we want to have an inflammatory response because that tells us that our body's working. It tells us it's developing this resistance to, if we are exposed to this particular virus, that we will have that messaging, that script in our immune ability to respond to that. So to suggest, say, from that we take something into our bodies and it's a causal relationship to a certain response, I think it takes quite a bit of looking into. Now, you can go to places like allergists, and they can do really extensive types of testing, and they're usually things of exclusion, right? So you exclude everything out of what you're doing, and then you build it back in and you see how you respond to that. FODMAPs is another type of thing that you can do as well. On the movement side, as far as there is genetic testing for fiber typing, so you can actually get your fiber, which again is when we're born. We have a certain ratio of fast twitch and slow twitch fibers, and you can actually get tested to see what you have and then design your exercise around that. Right. So if you have more slow twitch fibers, then you do things that are more endurance based or long type of things, low and slow, kind of long and slow type of things, versus you're probably not going to be a sprinter. The things that are out there, that are, what are your different levels, whether it's, your biochemical profile. Yeah, I think we have to take them and look at them in the whole big picture rather than just that one thing maybe being the cause of something.
Gotcha. Thank you for that answer.
Yeah. It was kind of a vague one, but that's kind of how it is. It's sort of, it's tricky because there is so much information, and how do we make those choices for ourselves? It's money, it's time, and kind of where to start. So it's important to ask. Yeah. Great.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cass.
Yeah.
So we are at 2:05. I'm actually going to pause the recording right now.